Good day, everyone. Welcome to chapter 23 in the textbook. We're getting to the very end here. And chapter 23 now is going to cover the subjunctive mood. For the next couple of chapters, we're going to be dealing with moods. And wanted to just go over what a mood is. What is a verbal mood? We've talked about this a little bit, but the verbal mood is what indicates the relationship of the verb to what is real. Now, this does not need to be real, but this is the relationship of reality, at least in the mind of whoever is presenting the idea, either the speaker or the writer. The indicative mood, we worked with that for the majority of this year, first and second quarters. And the indicative mood is the mood that is related to reality, where something is presented as reality. Anytime you have a regular verb, I walk, I go, he, she, or it sings, plays, anything like that. Okay, these are all indicative moods. They are presented as happening in fact. Since the end of last quarter, we have expanded this. There are some grammars that treat the participle as a separate mood. Others do not. This book kind of doesn't really answer the question. But yeah, the participle is generally seen as a different part of speech entirely, like a noun, adjective, verb, rather than a mood of a verb, just because the participle is so complicated. But then the other things that we've done, we've looked at the infinitive mood. This is the verbal idea just as a general idea of an action. Okay, not it. The slide says not in reference to a particular subject. So this is just to walk, to go, to speak, to eat. Nobody in particular is doing it. We're just kind of giving a name to an action. And now this chapter 23, brings us now to the subjunctive mood. The subjunctive mood is not reality. It is not presented as reality, but instead the subjunctive mood is what you would use to express either a wish or something that is contingent on something else. In other words, a possibility. A general way that this is translated is with the word might, or sometimes may. They basically have the same meaning in English. So you could say something, rather than I walk, which is indicative, you could say something like I might walk. All right, go is indicative, I might go is subjunctive. So you can see the difference. I might go expresses a possibility rather than a reality. I go to Disneyland is a statement of reality. Now, whether or not that is happening or not, I am presenting it as such. But when you change that to a subjunctive, I might go to Disneyland, you could say something like, I might go to Disneyland if there is a coronavirus vaccine. Okay, so now we're stating what that contingency is. The subjunctive verb is dependent on something else happening. I also have here maybe a bit of a silly example, but a verb in the indicative, if you use to be, you could say something like, I am a butterfly. And if I said that, you would all think that, yeah, the cheese had slid off my cracker there a little bit. Okay, I am a butterfly. I'm presenting this as fact, even though it's clearly not. But if you change that to the subjunctive, and this is one of the few times in English where this it really happens, okay, you would say something like, if I were a butterfly. Okay, and there's a song, right? If I were a butterfly, I thank you, Lord, for giving me wings, I think is how the song goes. And it's this cute little kid song, okay? So, again, expressing a contingency rather than a reality, okay? If I were a butterfly, then I would do this thing, but I am not, so I'm not. All right, so there's the idea of verbal mood and kind of an introduction to what the subjunctive is. Okay. When we go to the forms of the subjunctive, fortunately, the subjunctive mood is very simple in Greek. Rather than the 6 or 7 tenses that we have to worry about in the indicative, or the 3 tenses that are generally in other moods, like the infinitive and the participle, the subjunctive only has two sets of forms that we have to be concerned about. You have the present and the aorist, and then I put here only two sets of forms, okay, the active endings and the middle passive endings. They are exactly the same. There's only a couple of slight changes that determine a present or an aorist. And so, yeah, just two tenses that you have to worry about, two sets of forms that you need to remember. And all of the endings are based either off of the present active or the present middle passive. All right, so you get those two sets of endings down and you have all of the endings. It's very simple. The other thing that's super simple about this is that if you learned the indicative form endings very well, those first 6 endings that we did way back in chapter 3, which seems like, I don't know, like 10 years ago now, but luo, luace, lue, luamen, lueta, luusen, as well as the middle passive endings in chapter 12, all you have to do is take those standard indicative endings, the connecting vowel, okay, so the vowel that kind of starts the ending, just lengthen that vowel. An omicron gets lengthened to an omega, an epsilon or an alpha get lengthened to an eta. So I've given you a couple of examples here, okay? The first person plural, luamen, you look at the connecting vowel, there is an omicron there right in the middle of the word is your connecting vowel, so just lengthen that omicron into an omega. And you have luomen, which is the first person plural present active subjunctive ending. Okay, the first ending is an indicative, the second is a subjunctive, and you can see that it's just done by lengthening that connecting vowel. Luace, the second person singular indicative ending, just take that epsilon and lengthen it, and when you have an eta, the iota becomes an iota subscript, so you end up with luace with the eta and the iota subscript. The sigma stays the same from the indicative ending. Alright, so that's going to be a general principle of these subjunctive endings. One tip that tells you that a verb is subjunctive is the presence of that long vowel at the beginning of the verb ending there. Now, some of these forms doesn't actually help, it doesn't change anything. Alright, your first person singular, luo, that's an omega, so it's already a long vowel, so it just stays omega. That makes it very easy to learn the form, but translation can be a little bit tricky because notice luo becomes just luo, and so if you have that form there, that could be an indicative form, I loose or I am loosing, or it could also be a subjunctive form, I might loose or I might be loosing. Okay, so that you just have to study the context. And of course, indicative verbs are much more common than subjunctive verbs, so you should probably be thinking about that and leaning that way, unless you see some of the other giveaway words that we'll talk about here that do show up in this the vocabulary that tell you that something is probably going to be a subjunctive. Otherwise, yeah, you can just take that and assume that it's going to be indicative, and most of the time you will be right. Alright, so let's look at these forms here. I've put here the first chart is the present active subjunctive, and this corresponds to the first column there on page 177 of your textbook. Okay, and the textbook does not give you translations of this, mainly because the subjunctive has several ways of translating. It might not be too easy to put that into a chart, but I've given you a basic translation here, again using the word might. And so let's go over this. First person singular, luo, unchanged from the indicative again, so luo means I might loose. Luace, eta with an iota subscript, is the second person singular, you might loose. And then third person singular, lue. Again, taken from the indicative, the ending is epsilon iota, so the epsilon lengthens to the eta, and then you put the iota in the subscript, lue. Okay, that gives you he, she, or it might loose. A note on this form here, the third person singular of the present active subjunctive, be careful with this one, because if you go back to chapter 12, that ending there, an eta with an iota subscript, is identical to the second person singular present middle passive passive indicative. Okay, and so this form here, lambda, upsilon, eta, iota subscript, can mean, as it does here in this chart, he, she, or it might loose, but it also can mean, going back to chapter 12, you singular loose yourself. Okay, or the passive, you singular are loosed. Alright, so it can be second singular, present, middle, passive, indicative, you loose yourself, or it can be third person singular, present, active, subjunctive, he, she, or it might loose. Be careful with that particular form there. And again, context will tell you if you don't have a subject, or if the subject is stated to be you, well then, yeah, it's probably going to be the second person singular of the present, middle, passive, indicative. If you do have a third person singular subject stated, Jesus or Peter or any other thing, okay, then it probably is this one, okay, the third person singular of the subjunctive. I just wanted to let you know about that and get you thinking about that, because that single form can do double duty. Alright, moving on to the plurals, luomen. Again, that omega there tells you that it is subjunctive. We might loose. Then second person plural, lueta. Eta gives you the subjunctive, that long vowel. You might loose. And then luosen, okay, from luusen in the indicative, becomes luosen. And the movable nu there at the end, they might loose. Alright, if you have those active forms down, let's go on to the present middle passive subjunctive now. And this will give you the other set of forms, or the other set of endings. And again, it's just these two sets of endings that you have to memorize. You get the active forms memorized, that previous chart, and then you get these endings here. And you've got all of the endings down for the subjunctive. You just change the stem a little bit, and that changes it from present or aorist. Okay, so let's go over these. Present middle passive subjunctive, luomai. If you remember, this form in the indicative is luamai with an omicron, and so you lengthen the omicron to an omega. Luomai. Alright, now that gives you I might loose myself, or passive I might be loosed. Second person singular, again, be careful of this form here. Again, this is identical. If we go back to the active, have a look at that. Third person singular, present active subjunctive is lue. Here in the middle passive, the second person singular of the present middle passive subjunctive is lue. So actually now this form does not double duty, but triple duty. Alright, it could be, and if it's indicative, you loose yourself, or you are loosed. Then if it's subjunctive, it could be he, she, or it might loose, or it could also be you might loose yourself, or you might be loosed. Yeah, super annoying. I'm sorry about that, but yeah, this form can be kind of tough to translate, but yeah, fortunately, again, context will tell you most likely which one it is. Okay, so lue, second person singular, you might loose yourself, you might be loosed. Third person singular, luetai. In the indicative, this is luetai, so take that epsilon, lengthen it to the eta, and you get luetai, it might loose itself, it might be loosed. Just because I ran out of room here, I didn't put he, she, or it, but any one of those is possible for the third person singular. Okay, he, she, or it might loose itself. Moving on to the plurals, we have luometha. We might loose ourselves, or we might be loosed in the passive. Luestha, second person plural, you might loose yourselves, and you might be loosed in the you plural, and then third person plural, they might loose themselves, or they might be loosed, is luontai. Alright, omicron lengthens to omega here. Have a look at these forms. Memorize those endings really well, because we will see them again. Moving on now to the first aorist active subjunctive. You have, now because it is subjunctive, it is not indicative, so we're not going to have the epsilon in the front. Okay, the indicative is the only voice that gets the augment, epsilon. So in this case, we have an aorist, so it's going to still have a sigma on the end, But before, in the indicative mood and the participle, we had alphas going throughout here. In this case, they're not alphas, okay? Look at the endings here. They're exactly the same as the present active subjunctive a couple of slides ago, or on page 177. The only difference here, in the first aorist, we're going to put the sigma on the end there, and then use the exact same endings that we did for the present active. Okay, so instead of lu-o, lu-ace, lu-a, with the etas, all long vowels, it's lu-so, I might loose, lu-sace, you might loose, and lu-say, he, she, or it might loose. Plurals, lu-somen, lu-seta, and lu-sosin. And I've put that sigma in red so that you can see the difference between the present and the aorist. Okay. One thing to keep in mind here, if you notice, the translations are exactly the same as I had for the present, and that is the case. Okay, the difference between the aorist and the present in the subjunctive is really, really slight. Present tends to emphasize something that is continued, an action that is continued or repetitive. The aorist is just kind of the basic action. Okay, I might loose. Present could be I might loose, or it could, if you wanted to make it a little bit clearer, it could be I might be loosing. But it doesn't always work that way. Okay, but the present just has a slight emphasis on the continuation, and so if you're translating, take note of that, whether it's something as aorist or present. And the present could signify, yeah, that something is going on over a period of time, whereas the aorist is just naming the action and telling you that something might happen. All right, so hopefully that is very simple. The aorist active endings are identical to the present active, but the presence of the sigma will tell you. Now, sometimes the sigma is hidden. If you remember, there's the amalgamation rule, where if the stem ends in like a P, when you go to put the sigma on, it changes to a psi. You can have that too. Moving on then to the middle subjunctive, and these endings should be very similar too. They should be familiar to you. If you've learned the present middle passive subjunctive, you know these endings too. Lusomai, lusei, lusetai, lusometha, lusesta, lusontai. Okay, just like the active and the aorist, the endings are the same as the present middle passive. Only the presence of that sigma will tell you that it is first aorist. Okay, and again, yeah, I might loose myself. These are only middles, so if you notice, I did not put two definitions on here. It's just one because it's just middle here. I might loose myself. You might loose yourselves. You might loose yourself. Sorry. He, she, or it might loose itself. And then we, you, and they might loose themselves. Okay, so again, these forms should be very simple. Just add the sigma and then your familiar middle passive endings. Gives you the first aorist middle. And of course, the aorist has separate middle and passive forms, so let's go to the aorist passive. Now, somewhat annoyingly, the aorist passive has the same endings as the active. Even though the middle and passive are often identified together, in this case, the aorist passive takes the same endings as the actives. And as before, there is a letter at the end of the stem that tells you that this is aorist passive, but instead of a sigma, this is now a theta. And that's fairly typical. You know, with other forms that we have learned so far, the aorist passive gets at theta. And so you have lutho, luthase, luthe, luthomen, lutheta, luthosin. Right? And again, yeah, those endings, o, ace, a, omen, eta, osin, identical to your present or first aorist active endings. All right, the book doesn't cover this too much, but I thought that I would go ahead and give this to you. I'm not going to give you the full set of endings and such, but just to give you the active forms, the middle and passive forms take exactly the same pattern, but with your second aorist actives, what you're going to do is you're going to take your stem, and I've put this is right after lambano. There wasn't any great place to put this, but so right after the plural in that second column, you'll notice in the parentheses it says lambano. And lambano, the stem changes to lab in the aorist, lambda, alpha, beta. And that tells you that this is now an aorist stem. So with the second aorist, you take that changed aorist stem and then put the exact same endings on as we had before. Okay, if it's active, it's o, ace, a, omen, eta, osin. And so you have there labo. Okay, the way that you know this is aorist and not present is because of that changed stem. All right, the present would be lambano, but the aorist is labo. Gives you I might take or I might receive. If you remember, lambano has those two meanings. I just put one here though. I might take, you might take, he, she, or it might take. Okay, so again, the forms are very simple. These are standard active subjunctive endings as we've had in the first aorist and the present. Add that changed aorist stem, and this will go the same for the others. Okay, if you want to have an aorist middle, take your aorist stem, lab, and just put your middle ending on. Okay, so that would be labomai. Next one. Okay, this next chart. This is in your book, but it's not organized in this way, and you might just go right over it and not see it, just in case you run into this in one of the translations. Wanted to put this up here. Okay, the subjunctive of the to be verb. Okay, subjunctive of ami is real easy. Just take your endings, put a smooth breathing mark over the vowels, and that's your subjunctive of to be. All right, o, ace, a, omen, eta, osin. All of them have just the smooth breathing mark over them. I've put the second and third person singular as red, again, because I can't put a smooth breathing mark and an iota subscript at the same time. Okay, so both of those forms there should have a smooth breathing mark over the eta. All right, in the second person singular and the third person singular. They have both a smooth breathing mark and the iota subscript. So o, ace, a, omen, eta, osin, and yeah, have a look at the form charts for the active forms, and you'll see those are the endings. You just take those endings, pluck those endings right off of the stem of the verb, and put a breathing mark on it, and you have I might be, you might be, he, she, or it might be. The place where this is listed in the book is on page 178, right over bold heading number 152. It tells you the number 5 there. There's a numeral 5 in parentheses. It says the present subjunctive of a me is, and then it gives you these forms. Okay, but a lot of people just miss that. I wanted to make sure that everybody sees that because I do believe this can appear, and I think this appears in some of the translations. All right, now let's move on to, from the forms now to the uses of the subjunctive. Make sure you have the forms down really well. Pages 177 and 178. When we're talking about using the subjunctive mood generally expresses contingency or possibility. Okay, something is possible dependent on something else happening. You translate this might or would. A lot of times a wish or desire can be expressed in the subjunctive. In that case, you would use something like would. I would go to Disneyland if this stupid virus wasn't around. Yeah. Example of the subjunctive. The translations, again, as I mentioned before, the present and aorist are very similar. It's just that that present contains some kind of an element or a slight emphasis on that continuous nature of the action. I put here, even if it's not translated differently, because yeah, a lot of the times the Bibles, they're trying to translate something for clarity and not necessarily for the technical specs of the Greek word. And to translate, especially like the passive voices, this present passive ends up being something like I might be being loosed or something like that, and it's just really awkward and terrible. Okay, so a lot of times, yeah, even the English Bible translations, they won't translate a present like a continuous action, but if you see that, take note of it. All right, if you're translating directly from the Greek, or if you are using a commentary and it says something like this is a present subjunctive here, take note of that, because it's very likely that in the English translation of the Bible it is not mentioned that way. If you want to be super technical about this, you can translate the present subjunctive as something like keep on. Okay, I might keep on loosing, something like that. I might continue to loose. I might continue to take. Okay, so that is the general use of the subjunctive, might or may or would. Let's go to some specific uses here. And these are in your book. All right, I believe this is starting on page 179. The first one here is called the hortatory subjunctive. Hortatory, I've put down here, just think of it as a fancy way of saying this is giving an invitation. All right, one person is speaking out in a group, and it is an invitation or an exhortation for the group to do something together. Because of that nature just the definition of this kind of action, a person leading a group in something, this will always and only occur in the first person plural. If you have a hortatory subjunctive, it must be first person plural. You cannot have a hortatory subjunctive if it's third person, okay, or second person, or even first person singular. The hortatory subjunctive is always first person plural. But I've put here, be careful, the converse is not true. Okay, not all first person plural subjunctives are hortatory subjunctives. They can just be general subjunctives or one of these other ones where it's simply saying something like we might go. Okay, that would be a general translation of a first person plural subjunctive. But in context, a lot of times these are fairly common in the New Testament, particularly in the epistles. In English, you translate something like let us before the verb. So here is an example from the book of 1 John. Agapetoi, agapomen allelus. Agapomen is your verb, and you notice the omega there, it gives you a subjunctive, and it is a first person plural subjunctive. So this could be a hortatory subjunctive, and if it is, translate let us. Okay, beloved, let us love one another. So you see what's happening there. There is a speaker, in this case the letter writer of 1 John, and this letter writer is telling all of the audience, let's all do this together. Okay, beloved, let us love one another. Take note of this last part here. Okay, if the context clearly calls for it, this could be a general subjunctive, which would say something like, beloved, we might love one another. Okay, or we would love one another. Something like that. Okay, just a general statement of possibility rather than trying to mobilize everybody to do something. Okay, but the fact that this is first person plural means that hortatory translation is in play here. But it's, again, not you see a first person plural subjunctive, that does not necessarily mean it's going to be translated this way. All right, next one here, subjunctive of prohibition. The negative of when we have an indicative is the word oo, as we have seen for most of this year. And oo has a few other forms, right? Oo, ook, and ook with the key. Those different forms depending on what follows. But the base form is oo. Now, with anything else, any other mood, participle, infinitive, subjunctive, it's going to be may. All right, so this word may, it means the same thing as oo, okay, just not the negation. But there's a specific kind of subjunctive where it can be may plus the aorist subjunctive is used to prohibit the beginning of an action, the taking of an action, or the initiation of an action. Okay, so may plus the aorist. And the way that you translate this, something like don't begin to, or don't ever, don't start to, these are all possible translations. You are not supposed to begin the action. There is another way of saying that you should stop an action already in progress. Okay, this one, it is not an action in progress, but it's saying that you should not start to do it. Don't begin to, or don't ever. Example there, me meri meneste. That's a great contract verb there, meri menao. And it kind of sounds like somebody ruminating or gnashing their teeth or something. Me meri meneste. That word there means to worry, okay, or to fret. So do not worry about tomorrow. But really, this is an aorist. You can see the sigma there, right? Meri meneste gives you may plus the aorist. So a possible translation of this would be something like don't start to worry, don't ever worry, about tomorrow. Okay, you should not begin to do this action, because Jesus says it's kind of pointless. Okay, tomorrow will have enough trouble of its own. Again, this could be just a regular aorist subjunctive, right? So it could be you might not worry about tomorrow. If it's a standard subjunctive, you would not worry, or you might not worry about tomorrow. But because it's may plus the aorist, you can translate it this way. Don't begin to worry about tomorrow. Okay, this next one, again, there is a kind of clue that we're dealing with this, but it's not something that always is the case. When used in a question, the subjunctive often, it happens enough in the New Testament. I put there often indicates deliberation. Okay, somebody is choosing between like two or more options here. All right, should I do this or should I do that? And it is translated as should or shall. The example here is from Pilate weighing what to do with Jesus. Pilate clearly does not believe that Jesus is guilty of what he is being charged of, and so he's kind of publicly deliberating in his mind, what am I going to do? Okay, and he kind of sarcastically asks the temple leaders there, shall I crucify your king? Yeah, kind of, hey, shall I crucify your king? I could let him go. You really want me to do this? Shall I do this? Okay, deliberating over a choice. And I've put here, again, like all of these, context is going to tell you whether this is a deliberative subjunctive or just a regular subjunctive in a question. If it is a standard subjunctive, I have the translation as, may I crucify your king? Okay, might I crucify your king? Is it a possibility that I would crucify your king? Clearly it's not this one, right? Pilate is the Roman governor. He's not asking them for permission, or he's not telling them about a possibility. He's actually deliberating in his own mind whether he should do this. Okay, but just from the form there, it could be, may I crucify your king? I'm asking permission for you to do this. Okay. Last one here, subjunctive of emphatic negation. This one is an interesting one here. It doesn't occur a lot, but when it does, it's very easy to recognize. The subjunctive, normally, as we mentioned before, the subjunctive is used with may to express a negation. But then on somewhat rare occasions, the double negative is seen, and the double negative makes it stronger. Okay, it adds on. Not. Two nots means really not. I've put here an example in English. If something is not uncommon, it is not uncommon to see rain and sun together if you're in the tropics. Okay? If you're in Hawaii, you can often see sun shining and then it's raining on your head. Okay, that is not uncommon, which means, if you want to be totally clear, that not uncommon actually means common. But in Greek, that's not the case, okay? The double negative adds on to each other, so it makes it more negative. So this emphatic negation subjunctive is translated as certainly not. Really, really not. The example there, ou me eis elthe te, eistain basilean ton uranon. You will surely not enter into the kingdom of heaven. So here you have emphatic negation, double negative makes something super negative. I've put a note here on some of the vocab words for this chapter. The vocab should be very, very simple. I think you only have like 8 or 10 words in the vocab this chapter. And 2 of them are these words that tell you pretty strongly that something is going to be subjunctive. It's not always, but a lot of the time, if you see these words, what follows or what is associated in that clause is going to be a subjunctive verb. The 2 words here are hina. First one there, hina, in order that or that. These things all happen in order that the scriptures might be fulfilled. Uses this word hina. Okay, in order that or so that or that. This next one here, this is kind of a weird word. Okay, this word on, short little word in Greek. This is untranslatable. Okay, it doesn't have a meaning that that goes nicely into English. The only thing that this on does is it takes a statement that would normally be definite, referring to something in particular, and you stick that on in there, and it makes it sort of indefinite and muddies the waters. Example here, kai has, that relative pronoun from the previous chapter. Okay, you should be able to recognize this by now. Kai has on thele en humin enai protos estai humin doulos. Whoever wishes to be first among you will be your servant. I've put the sentence down here without the on. Okay, and without the on, then it changes from a subjunctive to an indicative mood. So it says, and the one who wishes to be first among you will be your servant. Okay, the one who wishes. We're talking about a definite person here. Okay, the one who. But if you put the on there in the previous example, the on sort of muddies that. And so instead of the one who wishes, this becomes whoever wishes. Anybody who wishes. Okay, now we're not talking about a definite, specific person, but just indefinite, whoever wishes. Okay, and that's the work of that on. The on changes the definite indicative verb to a sort of indefinite, muddy subjunctive one. Alright, so that is that word there. When you put this onto a vocab quiz, just put something like makes definite statement indefinite. Okay, I think the textbook says something like untranslatable particle that adds an element of indefiniteness. Okay, if you just want to say something like makes a definite statement indefinite, you're not going to be able to translate it anyway. It does not have a sort of single one-to-one meaning in English. Alright, the last element in this chapter, conditional sentences. These are sentences, they're somewhat complex sentences. They always consist of two parts. Okay, you're going to have two clauses. One of them is going to be an if clause, and this is the part that starts with an if. If this, then something else. Okay, so you have the if clause that sets it up. If this contingency, then a result clause. Okay, so you're always going to have these two parts. I put here the then. The word then usually is not translated, okay, as you'll see in these examples. But that's really what it's saying. Okay, if something happens, then something else. You will notice if you go to the textbook, the book uses these like fancy grammatical terms. Okay, the if clause is called the protasis. The then clause is called the apodosis. Maybe I should have used those, but you probably haven't heard these terms. I didn't hear these terms until I started teaching this class. So you probably don't need to learn these. So I just called these the if clause and the then clause. Not surprisingly, in the Greek, the if clause will start off with a word that means if. There are two words that mean if in Greek. Okay, the first one is a, epsilon iota with a smooth breathing mark. The other way of doing it is the word on. And this is literally the word a for if, plus that funny untranslatable little particle word on. You squish those together and you get on. And this if is usually used with the subjunctive. Alright, so there you have conditional sentences. You have all of these are going to have an if clause and a then clause, and the if clause can be introduced in Greek with one of two words, okay, a or on. Now let's take a look at these four categories of the sentences. First off, the simple condition. This is called the category 1. The simple condition, somebody is presenting something as reality. I've put here as sort of a standard caveat. This may not be real, but the speaker or writer is presenting it that way. The speaker could be lying to you, and it could be unreal, but they're presenting it that way. Okay, and if this is the case, then the if clause is going to be introduced with a, and the verb is in the indicative. Okay, pretty standard with that form of if. The verb is often in the indicative, and so the then clause is going to have a verb in the indicative mood as well. Okay, so if clause, A plus the indicative, the then clause has the indicative on it too. There's a nice chart here that the book gives you on page 183. Okay, they use those fancy terms protasis and apodosis. Protasis is your if clause, apodosis is the then clause. Okay, so here is an example of one of these simple condition sentences. A de pneumati ageste. There's your if clause, right? A introduces it, and then ageste is in the indicative mood. If you are being led by the Spirit. Then your then clause here, uk este hupahumon. Indicative mood needs to appear in the then clause, and we do have este, the second person plural of to be. So, if you are being led by the Spirit, then you are not under the law. And this is an example of what I said before. You usually don't have to translate the word then. It's sort of understood as the second part of one of these conditional sentences. Okay? If you are being led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Paul is presenting this as a true thing. Okay, second part of this, the second category of these conditional sentences, called the contrary to fact condition. In this one here, condition 1, or category 1, the speaker or author assumed that the statement was true. Here, with the condition 2, the speaker assumes that the statement or the premise is untrue. How do we tell this? By the forms of the sentence. Okay, you're going to have A in the if clause again, and A occurs with the indicative mood. Pretty standard. Your then clause is going to have a verb in the indicative, and it is going to be used with this funny particle on. Okay, again, we're going to have that on, which muddies the waters now, and it's going to take this from something that is presented as true to something that is understood to be untrue. Okay, giving that sort of element of indefiniteness again, but in a different way. And here's one of the few times that you're going to see on used with something other than a subjunctive. I've put here a very powerful example in the New Testament. This is given in your textbook as an example, but this is my favorite one, actually. I've built a couple of sermons around this. Eis hoda uk an mu apethanen ha adelphos. This is from the story of Lazarus dying, and then, spoiler alert, being raised from the dead at the end of the story. But in the middle of the story, Jesus comes to the village where this man who died lived. Lazarus' sister Martha first comes out, and then Mary, the other sister, comes out later. And both of them tell Jesus this. Okay, Martha first goes out to meet Jesus, and she tells him this. And if you're just reading this in English, it just reads like a regular kind of statement. Okay, if you were here, my brother would not have died. Sure, right? We know Jesus is powerful. Jesus is the Messiah. In the Gospel of John, Jesus is God. And so Martha tells him, Lord, if you were here, my brother would not have died. Sure, it's a true statement if you believe. But in the Greek, if you look at this, you have A with the indicative mood there. Eis is your indicative mood verb. It's the past tense of to be. Okay, if you were here. Then the then clause starts at the uk. Okay, uk on mu apethanen. My brother would not have died. And there's an example of this on not being translated, but it turns this from my brother did not die to, with the on there, it becomes my brother would not have died. And only in the Greek do you get this. Okay, this is a pretty strong rebuke that Martha is giving to Jesus. It's pretty, dare I say it, it's pretty disrespectful, okay, especially considering that Martha is a woman at the time, and she's addressing Jesus, who's, oftentimes addressed as like rabbi, like teacher. Okay, he's pretty exalted here, even without being God. Okay, but he's usually addressed in these very respectful terms. Martha comes out here and says, Lord, if you were here, my brother would not have died. suggesting that what she's saying is, if you had been here, but you weren't, my brother would not have died, but he did. Okay, the unspoken sort of thing hanging in the air here is, Lord, you weren't here for us, where were you? And this becomes even more powerful because at the beginning of the story, the sisters send word that Lazarus is ill, and the way that they word it is, Lord, the one that you love is ill. Okay, this is not just anybody, it's like your close friend, the one whom you love is ill. And Jesus tarries in the place where he's at for like 3 days. Alright, so the request is, Lord, the one whom you love is ill, please come soon because you're the only one who can do anything for him. And then when Jesus waits, when he's held up and Lazarus dies, then his sister comes out and says, Jesus, where the heck were you? We sent that message a long time ago, and you weren't here. And so if you had been here, you weren't here, my brother wouldn't have died, but there he is in the tomb. There he's dead. And it's your fault. Okay, so here it's this contrary to fact condition that only comes out in the Greek, and it is all just that one little word, that on, that can't even be translated in English. Okay, so there's a good example of why it really pays to know what's behind this. Alright, next category, the third category, probable future. Okay, this is something that's probable, so it's kind of tipped the scale to more than likely, but it is not certain. It's condition in the future. You're going to have the if clause. Now, the previous two were introduced with the word a. For the if, this one is now on. And the verb correspondingly comes in the subjunctive. The then clause is going to use a future indicative verb, hence probable future, right? So, kai tuta poiesamen, there's your future. Okay, notice the sigma there after the lengthened vowel. This is from poieo in chapter 19, so do or make. And then eon epitrepe ha theos. Long vowel there in the ending gives you a subjunctive. Eon plus the subjunctive gives you this probable future. Okay? And this we will do if God permits. Okay? Something that's going to be likely, we think that God will permit it, but hey, he's God, we're not, so we can't say for sure. We don't want to be, presumptuous here. But, we know the character of God, we know God loves us, so this we will do if God permits. It's probably going to happen. Okay, but we're going to keep it as a probable future and not something that is for sure. I've put here, in all of the examples that we've had before, and typically the way that these are formulated, the if clause goes first. Okay, if you're being led by the Spirit, then you're no longer under the law. The if is first. But this here is an example of the if clause being second in the sentence. They can do that. They can switch it around just fine, but usually the way that they're formulated, the if clause comes first. Okay, here the then clause is first, and that's okay. Yeah, you kind of have to pay close attention to that though, because yeah, you get so used to doing the if clause first. Well, yeah, then they throw you a curveball like this. Okay, so probable future. We think something is likely to happen, but we can't say with 100% certainty. Last category here, and this should be the, I believe this is going to be your last slide, so we're almost done. The present general. This is something that is presented by the speaker as a proverb or a maxim, something that is generally true in the present all the time. Okay, all of your proverbs, that you think of, dealing with sayings that are generally true over the course of human history, over everybody. These are good ideas that you can, keep in mind. The if clause with this present general is going to be introduced with on, and because it's on, it's going to take the subjunctive. Your then clause is going to use the present indicative. Okay, so I think all of your then clauses use the indicative, but they use it in various ways. Okay, here it's just straight up present indicative. but it's introduced the if clause with on plus subjunctive. And here's an example. Okay, on apomen, right off the bat, on plus your subjunctive. Right, that apomen is a subjunctive with the long vowel. Hati hamartion uk ekomen. He aletheia uk estin en humin. If we say, or you can even say if we should say, but to make it really subjunctive, but if we say that we do not have sin, then the truth is not in us. Something that is generally true pretty much all time. Anybody who comes up to you and says, hey, you know what, congratulate me, I haven't sinned for the last 4 years. Guess what, they're lying to you, okay? If we say that we do not have sin, the truth is not in us. I actually had a professor who said he had a really weird encounter like that at a camp meeting. He gave a presentation, and some guy came up to him afterwards and said, Professor, you're wrong. You said that we can't overcome sin in this life. Well, I haven't been sinning. I haven't been sinning for 4 years. I haven't committed a sin for 4 years. All right. Should have read this passage. Okay, this is from 1 John. 1 John, I think chapter 2, I believe is where this is. Okay. So yeah, there's your present general. That is the last of these conditional sentences. Go over those. There's that nice summary chart there, again, on page 183 at the very end of chapter 23. There are a few vocab terms also there to learn. Get those in your heads, and I'll send some materials over. All right, otherwise, yeah, that's it for chapter 23. We're just about done with everything here. Congratulations for surviving this far. I hope everyone is having a good quarter, and we'll see you next time. All right, bye.